Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Around the Coin. Today's guest is Alan Chiu, the co-founder and CEO of Enya Labs. Enya Labs is the development shop, the agency, the organization behind Boba Network. And Boba has raised over $45 million in their Series A from over 400 different investors around the world. They did so earlier in the year, and we talked about how the recent crash in the crypto world has impacted Boba. We talked about the lessons that Alan would instill on other founders leading well-funded and important crypto projects. Boba is primarily focused on hybrid computing, or connecting the Web2 world and enterprise with blockchain, decentralization, Web3. We talked about a few of the examples that they're working on today and a few that are coming down the pipeline in the future, and how they're managing cash and their employees and their general strategy going into the next few years. It was really interesting to hear Alan's perception on what has happened so far and what is possibly anticipated for the future. We touched on some regulation, we touched on some strategy, really a well-rounded conversation, and I hope you enjoy. The show today is sponsored by Kickfurther. Kickfurther is the world's first online inventory financing platform that enables companies to access funds that they were unable to acquire through traditional sources. Kickfurther connects brands to a community of eager buyers who help fund the inventory on consignment and give brands the flexibility to pay that back as they receive cash from their sales. Check out kickfurther.com for more information and view their upcoming investment opportunities, and use kickfurther.com/get10, GET10, to claim your credit. And I hope you enjoy. Here is Alan Chiu. All right, Alan, I'm excited to chat with you. Thank you for hopping on the podcast today. How's your
Hi.
day going so far?
Good to see you. Thanks for having me. It's been a great day so
Yeah.
far. How's yours?
Yeah, good. So you're working on a few different projects here. Maybe I'll pass it to you to give me a quick overview of the different projects you're involved in, companies you're involved in, and we'll take it from there. Tell me just top of mind.
Sure. Well, my primary focus right now is building Enya Labs, and Enya Labs is a blockchain software company, and we're focused on building out Boba Network, which is a blockchain scaling platform that connects Web3 infrastructure with the Web2 and enterprise world. So that's my main focus, where my almost all of my energies go. I volunteer at Stanford on the alumni board of the Stanford Business School. I'm also co-president of the Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs Network, and I've been doing that for quite some time now. Help scale it from a local chapter in the Bay Area to now a global federation of chapters around the world.
When Web3 and enterprise Web2 come together, what does that look like today? What are the actual state of affairs in enterprise as far as blockchain and crypto adoption?
Yeah, well, we're going through a very interesting phase. I think the enterprise world went through a period where the primary focus was on permissioned blockchains, and that actually took away a lot of the power that blockchains bring to the table, being permissionless, right? That was the breakthrough innovation. But enterprises legitimately have a lot of concerns about access to data, access control, and data privacy. And so the permissioned blockchain movement, I think there's still a few deployments out there actually in production and doing great work. But by and large hasn't really taken the industry by storm. I think the next phase is going to be what we're enabling, what we're focused on building out here, which is enabling existing enterprises to leverage their data assets, to leverage what they already know about their customers, to leverage those insights to create a more personalized and more compelling on-chain experience. And we're going to start seeing the emergence of applications that bring the best of both worlds together, such as DeFi protocols that offer on-chain yield that's a reflection of some real-world assets. So where the protocol would actually go off-chain and verify the off-chain yield of the real-world assets, and then adjust the on-chain yield accordingly. We're also going to start seeing more personalized NFTs that are dynamically synced with the off-chain behaviors of individual users or consumers or customers of these companies. The interplay between the off-chain world and the on-chain world at a more granular, more personalized level is going to, one, help the enterprises leverage their strengths. They don't have to build Web3 applications from scratch that's isolated from what they already have done, but rather leverage their strengths to build something on chain that is even more compelling and differentiated and that their competitors can't replicate. And two, it's also going to make blockchains more relevant to the day-to-day lives of ordinary users, because rather than asking them to jump through a lot of hoops and build relationships with whole new applications and brands, we're talking about extending their relationships with companies that they already work with and know well into the blockchain world. And hopefully we'll get to a point where these users don't even think about blockchains at the end of the day, right? Where the infrastructure and the technology fades into the background and they're just simply enjoying the new benefits and the new powers that are enabled by the new technology.
Mm. And Boba Network, I have a note here, raised $45 million in a Series A earlier this year in April from 400 investors. Can you tell me a little bit about how that deal was constructed and how those funds were just the general architecture of the deal?
Yeah, the round actually came together in Q4 last year, but it wasn't announced until April. And the reason we ended up with several hundred investors for the network is because we felt that the exercise wasn't really focused on fundraising per se. It was focused on building an alliance of folks who would be really helpful in building out the ecosystem around Boba. And beyond the sheer number of investors, there are investors in Boba who have really interesting networks, really helpful network in key markets around the world, such as in Korea, Japan, and other countries. There are investors who can help the network tap into really compelling talent flows, bringing marketers and engineers to projects. And there are others with really deep technical knowledge around certain areas that could be providing us with great advice. And so the idea is really to bring together. It's like building an alliance where each individual member has something to contribute to the mission. And the fact that they also bring capital to the table, of course, is great as well. And it also helps to align incentive where they have skin in the game and they care about the success of the project.
Okay. And Boba Network is a decentralized protocol. So when you raise a Series A for a decentralized protocol, are people contributing? Are they wiring money to Enya, and then that's considered the Series A for Boba? Are they sending some kind of tokens? Like what money flow is happening and what ownership is transpiring in that deal?
So these investors basically bought Boba tokens in a private sale. So the transactions happen between the Boba Foundation and the individual investors.
Got it. So they're buying Boba tokens. They're taking their US dollar maybe, or whatever currency they're in. They're going to exchange, buying Bitcoin or something, and then they're transferring Bitcoin for Boba tokens on some exchange.
So it's actually more straightforward than that. It gave the foundation stable coins, and in exchange, the foundation gave them Boba tokens.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah, it was a private sale.
And why is that called a Series A as opposed to a ICO or a token sale?
It's more a reference to the stage of development of the project, and also the size of the round, how much capital was raised. Prior to that, there was only a tiny seed round that preceded a Series A just a couple months ago. So that's why it was called a Series A.
And I'd say we're now recording December 2nd. There's a significant depression in the funding for crypto, Web3, the whole thing. if you were to structure a de novo deal, new company, or just advise another project on how to do it, how should crypto founders think about structuring deals now? Because with the caveat that it seems like tokens have been used, there is certainly an influence for governance. Based on how many tokens you have, you can vote on a community board, and then that tells the development team what they have to work on. But it's also largely used for funding. Do you think that will continue? Do you think there's a better way to conduct funding rounds where people take ownership in some company that's building the core products on the protocol? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you've learned and maybe what you see going forward on funding structures.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's no one right answer. It really depends on what you're building. So, for example, there are a lot of companies in this space that are, even though they are in crypto or Web3 per se, but they are building software or providing services that where it doesn't feel natural to have a token as part of the solution. And therefore, they will be raising capital in the traditional startup way through equity sale. And that works perfectly fine. They just happen to be a service provider in the Web3 space. So my suggestion is don't create a token for the sake of fundraising, right? If the token has utility, it's part and parcel to the solution, to what you're building, and if there's interest from investors to acquire those tokens, then go with that flow. And legally how that's set up varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. A lot of lawyers are great at that, so make sure you work with great legal counsel to make sure that you're compliant with your local jurisdictions. But yeah, the first order bit is don't create token for the sake of fundraising. Don't force it. Don't commit any unnatural act.
And how do you think about the practical use of tokens now? It seems like people are more skeptical of the pragmatic function for tokens. And on paper, I can see a lot of use cases where tokens provide some incentive structure for people to take action within some ecosystem. And they also provide a mechanism for funding, for better or for worse, and they provide governance. Those to me seem like the three pillars: governance, funding, and incentives for action. I talk to some people and I get a full spectrum of opinions on this. Some people say, oh, that's absolutely true, and this early stage of price speculation for the tokens is going to die down, and then people are going to perform functions on the protocol based on the incentive for the tokens. Other people completely doubt it altogether and say that tokens are just used to raise money. They're not actually incentivizing, and people just purchase the tokens with the hope that the price goes up. People aren't actually taking actions on the protocol as designed by the developers. What are you seeing and what are you feeling about that to be true? The impact of tokens either for real, practical function or for price speculation?
Well, I think all of the above are true depending on the context, right? Going back to my earlier point, if the token doesn't have really inherent utility in the product that you're building or in the network, then yeah, what other use is it other than for speculation, right? On the other hand, if the token has real use, such as the ones that you've described, then it makes sense, which is why you've heard these differing opinions. It's because they have experienced they're reflective of their own experience with the tokens that they've worked with, and not all tokens were created with real utility in mind. And so that's why we're seeing that it's kind of this old story of four blind folk feeling around an elephant, and they all come away with different description. It's one elephant, but whether you happen to have touched the leg or the trunk will give you a different flavor of what an elephant actually is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. So how do you think, I guess for maybe Enya or Boba specifically, what's the function of tokens? How do you think about going forward, investing in and furthering the incentive structure for tokens versus moving on from the idea of tokenomics? How do you sort of balance that or think about that?
Yeah, tokens actually play a very important role. So in the case of Boba, right, in resource allocation, uh, regardless of how scalable and a blockchain infrastructure or platform is, the compute resources, the storage resources are always limited. There's always a ceiling, right? So there has to be a way to meter the use of resources, and that's why like Ethereum has ETH as a fee token. So Boba is also the fee token for the Boba network. Um, Boba also has a unique protocol called hybrid compute, where developers can write smart contracts using hybrid compute to call off-chain APIs, to interact with Web2 services, to query enterprise data stores, and to talk to off-chain gaming engines and a lot of other users. And every hybrid compute API call also requires the use of Boba tokens. And it doesn't cost a lot, but it helps to prevent DDoS attacks, spamming, and overuse of these finite resources. So tokens actually play a real role in resource allocation when it comes to the operations of a network. And in terms of incentives, Boba Network has had run an incentive program called WAGME earlier this year. There's a proposal that Enya put forward around V tokenomics, but we've been receiving feedback from the community that, given the current market conditions, now might not be the best time to roll out an incentive program, but because you start pushing on a rope.
Mm-hmm.
So the incentives would go a lot further and be a lot more effective when market conditions are much better for the whole space. So as you mentioned, Boba is a decentralized project, and so whether any particular proposal goes forward or not really depends on the wishes of the community.
Got it. Yeah, so true. And what's an example? So what's an enterprise company that you can mention, and how are they using it? And just to frame it out a little bit more in detail so I can picture what's happening.
Yeah. So there's a top university that we're working with.
Stanford?
Well, nothing official yet, so can't name names. But there's a top university that we've been working with to develop their official on-chain NFT degree NFTs. So these are non-tradable NFTs, similar to soulbound tokens. So let's say you're an alum of this university, you'll receive one of these NFTs that represents your degree on chain. And because of hybrid compute, we're able to create these make these NFT query that university's database to verify that you actually have certain degrees from that university. And as you may go back and get another degree, and that will get reflected in your NFT as well. And if you extrapolate from that design pattern, what we're talking about here is one, a self-sovereign, decentralized identity on chain that leverages your off-chain data for verification, because we all still live in an off-chain world. And so making these connections so that folks have confidence and trust in the on-chain identity that they see actually is valuable. If you further extrapolate that out, what we're talking about is a personalized NFT, or more broadly speaking, personalized on-chain experience that's based on off-chain data, owned and curated and verified by real-world enterprises, companies.
Like a school,
right?
like a
school.
college. Are there?
It could be a association of some sort that would verify your membership, right? We could use the same pattern to create an official NFT to show that, hey, you are licensed to practice medicine in the state of California, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many use cases that come to mind. I mean, everything in the government, your driver records, everything on LinkedIn. Like, how do we know, right? I could just put in any logo I want.
Mm-hmm.
What is the most functioning integration with an enterprise? You mentioned that's in beta and you can't mention the school or whatever, but are there actual companies utilizing this Boba network now, or any connection to enterprise, or is it still early days?
it's still early days, as with any new platform and new capabilities. Um, but these use and enterprises are cautious, right? We're talking about exposing some of their data or using some of their data for on-chain purposes. And once things go on-chain, they are public, and so it takes time to and it's right to take time to be prudent and be cautious and thoughtful about how customer data, user data, student data is going to be used in a public setting.
What have you learned? I mean, did you go into this thinking enterprises were going to be excited to, I mean, maybe let's talk about other examples, but I'm just picturing the diploma example. And did you learn that they are less excited or that they somehow look at the incentive structure differently? If you were to give yourself advice 2 years ago, what would it be? Like, how do you sort of think about what you learned so far about enterprises' incentive and desire to move on chain?
One of the things I've learned is that, just like the technology adoption cycle, this notion of crossing the chasm that Jeffrey Moore came up with more than a couple of decades ago now, still remains true. And that means identifying the part of the market that belongs to the early evangelists, the early adopters, the innovators is really important. If you end up going after those who are the early majority or late majority who tend to follow the innovators and early adopters, you're just going to be wasting your time. But if you happen to be talking to the innovators and early adopters, they will actually show you the way. They will tell you, look, we've been thinking about this problem, how we're going to adapt in this new world, and we've been fishing for a solution. And those conversations are invaluable, and only the innovators and early adopters in any particular space would be thinking that way. So my advice to other founders and entrepreneurs would be, pay attention to how, when you're talking to a potential customer, to a prospect or a potential user, pay attention to how they're describing the problems, their desires. And if you're creating new technologies and enabling new possibilities, look for the ones that are forward-looking. Like in this case, this school that is thinking about, what will alumni engagement look like in the metaverse going forward? How do we know when someone shows up at a school event that they are a legitimate alum? How do we help alumni feel comfortable that someone that they're interacting with in the metaverse is truly someone from the same alumni community, right? So the way they're talking about the problem they're trying to solve is very forward-looking, future-oriented. And that's always a good sign.
And do you feel Boba is focused on schools, on specifically this problem of putting diplomas on chain?
No, this particular problem is or use case is far along enough that we can talk about. There are others conversations that we're having that are earlier stage that will probably let them cook for a little bit longer before we talk in more specific about them.
But generally, would it be, what are other ideas like putting ticketing for baseball games? Jog my creativity here a little bit. It would be,
so it could be, hypothetically speaking, right? Let's say Starbucks, they know a lot about their customers' purchase behaviors. I mean, the Starbucks wallet actually is one of the largest mobile wallets in terms of flow, the amount of money stored in those wallets. So they certainly know a lot about their customers' purchase history, where they buy, what they buy, when, in exquisite detail. Well, they can actually, we can help them leverage that data set to create very personalized NFTs on chain. And they don't have to be NFTs. They could be just any sort of personalized on-chain experience based on every individual Starbucks customer's purchase history and behavioral patterns over the years.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And Starbucks wouldn't be able to do that themselves. They wouldn't be able to build their own app that does that.
I mean, all our code is open source. They can just take our code. That works too. Not our code, I mean, Boba's code. It's what Enya's contributed. But it will be so much easier to partner with Boba, and Enya can help them build it and take advantage of hybrid compute. Because hybrid compute is really enabled by rollups. We wouldn't have been able to do it on layer one, which is why Boba started out as a layer two. And so in order to enable this type of on-chain, off-chain interoperability and connectivity, you really need to become expert in layer twos. You need to become expert in how Boba's hybrid compute protocol works, and also stay up with the latest innovations in this whole roll-up space, because we're still early in the roll-up game, and there's a lot of innovation happening. And so for most companies where blockchain scaling is not their core business, why expend resources in building out that whole foundation? It's much more makes much more sense for them to just partner.
And what is a rollup?
A roll-up is a roll-up is a mechanism to, first of all, decouple the execution of smart contract transactions from the consensus protocol. And it also aggregates multiple transactions into one block, and therefore makes more efficient use of the block space on the layer one. And these attributes come together to deliver 1 to 2 orders of magnitude going forward. Could be more of performance improvement and cost reduction compared to performing transactions on layer ones directly.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons is because when execution happens on the base layer, on the layer one blockchain, the transactions are replicated across the entire network. So you're repeating the same work over and over again, as part of achieving consensus. But rollups allow execution to happen outside of layer one, and so you're only doing the transaction once, but you're still leveraging the security that comes with the layer one's consensus protocol to secure these transactions. As part of the design of rollups, there's also a mechanism for independent third parties to verify that the transactions have been executed correctly. And there are different approaches to doing that. Generally, it's called fault proving or fraud proving. And that's what's led to different forms of rollups, such as optimistic rollups or ZK rollups, because these different architectures validate transactions using different mechanisms.
And would you say rollups are the point of layer two, so that they make the blockchain storage of data more efficient, because they're packaging 1,000 transactions together and then they're sending it to layer one? So that's really the reason why people build layer two.
Yeah, and also to decouple execution from consensus, so that you don't need to execute the same transactions over and over again across the entire layer one network.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
It saves compute. So it saves both on compute and storage.
Got it. And then when people are building, so you'd have Boba is a layer two, meaning that you have a set of tools that people can build an application on top of Boba, so that it connects to your code base and your servers, and you're batching those transactions and sending them to Ethereum's layer one. Correct.
Yeah, from the developer's perspective, it's just like building on Ethereum.
Right.
Same EVM or Ethereum virtual machine.
And the advantage of using Boba is that it's faster.
It's faster, it's cheaper, and it gives you this additional power to connect with Web2 services or enterprise data stores or off-chain gaming engines that are not available on layer ones or other layer twos.
Gotcha. And then when Boba is building what you're building, you're building all this complicated, amazing technology. Are you primarily focused on selling new developers to come build on top of Boba? Or are you focused on a sales team that's going to go out and pitch Stanford and Harvard and Starbucks and other companies to develop their tokenization or Web3 products? Like, and those am I right in understanding that that's a significantly different sales funnel?
Yeah, those are very different. So with developer evangelization is always going to be important when it comes to introducing new capabilities. It takes time for developers to learn what they can do with these new powers. And that's an ongoing effort. It takes patience. So, and we're starting to see some of the early signs, early fruits of those efforts, especially amongst game developers, because hybrid compute allows smart contracts to talk to off-chain API, including APIs of gaming engines. It also makes things like random number generation so much easier for developers. So we're starting to see game developers use hybrid compute for within their Web3 games. Beyond that, would be the next phase would be approaching the enterprise market, such as what we've been discussing. And in those conversations, the focus is less on developer evangelization, because these enterprises themselves are in a different business, right? They're not Web3 native to begin with. And what they care about is, how do they deliver a better customer experience? How do they stay ahead of their competition? And so the work so in this case, Enya is more involved in working side by side with these companies to figure out what makes the most sense for their users and customers, and building these solutions for them, as opposed to evangelizing their own internal developers to build.
Gotcha. Okay. And so Enya basically keeps the lights on. Enya is a development agency.
Yeah, it's a software development company.
Gotcha. And it's a core development, it's a core group of people that help to build out the Boba network.
Yes.
Gotcha. And so given where we are today, with like FTX's collapse and people are skeptical of putting their money in exchanges, and I would imagine funding to projects has declined sharply. How have you managed that internally as a leader, and what steps have you taken? And when you describe those, I'm curious to hear your description, particularly as it relates to other people who may be in a similar position. Like what are people generally doing in leadership positions that are managing a similar structure, where you've raised a bunch of money, you have a development shop, you have an external protocol that you want to build in the future, but you kind of have to weigh the impacts of like, well, how do we generate cash in the short term? Do we go and build stuff here? How do you you're in the boardroom, you're in the war room. How do you think about managing the current climate with the tools and teams you have?
Yeah, we're fortunate that there's several years of runway in our situation. So at least we're not dealing with any sort of existential crisis for ourselves. But certainly...
quick question, sorry to interrupt you on that. Is that because you have it in US dollars as opposed to the reserve currency being in tokens?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Oh, the foundation has a treasury denominated in Boba as well, but when we're talking about runway, we're not talking about tapping into that part of the treasury.
Got it.
So at least we're not dealing with any existential crisis ourselves, but the ecosystem is badly hurt, right? And a lot of other projects are dealing with funding issues or resource constraints that will impede their ability to deploy, to execute, or to survive in some cases. So that certainly affects us indirectly as well. And we're doing everything we can to help. For example, internally, we're working on a data product to help developers more easily identify the most active users so that they can target their incentives more effectively. In terms of what leaders do, so first of all, you have to acknowledge and recognize the reality, which sounds straightforward, but for founders, is actually one of the most common traps is to fall into wishful thinking. Because founders have strong conviction about future state that they have envisioned and are working towards creating, right? So you have to always think about the future and live in the future, but at the same time, that brings with it the risk of wishful thinking, wishing the reality were different than it is today. And so first task is to make sure as founders, we don't fall into that trap of wishful thinking and looking at reality as it is. And looking at reality also means not being overly pessimistic. When a catalytic event such as the implosion of FTX happens, media loves to jump on these stories and the myth and the sentiment is always the sky is falling. Well, and it is bad, but it doesn't mean that the world is ending. So looking at things, reality as it is, also means not getting too pessimistic either. It also means calmly assessing the situation, identifying, okay, what are the assets that we have? What are the strengths that we still have? Where are the new elements of the new reality that will impact us? Let's identify all of them. And let's also figure out, what are the new opportunities that might be enabled by the new reality? And putting together, so in a couple of weeks, we're actually bringing the leadership team of Enya together for an on-site. We're a distributed team, so we don't have a lot of opportunity to get together in person, but we're actually getting together in person to bring everyone's thoughts and observations and insights together to make sure that we're looking at the new reality as comprehensively from all perspectives as possible.
Got it. And so what does that mean? I mean, what does that entail in detail? Does that mean like, hey, funding is not going to be available for 12 months? What would be?
We're assuming no external funding for at least 2 years. That's what we're planning for. Definitely have a preference for pursuing opportunities that would bring in revenue sooner rather than later. We are still growing, still hiring, but in a very cautious way. But there are a lot of great talents out there that are available now that weren't available even just a few months ago. And we don't want to miss the opportunity of working with them. This is what we're doing.
And how many development shops that are building on their protocols are shifting to just software development? Hey, I'm going to, you have Enya, there's, other development shops out there that are building, primarily focused on building that protocol. But like you say, you have to balance the realistic world we're in. Are you seeing other dev shops start to just take on client projects for, a car company, something just, hey, we got a bridge, we got to survive. We're going to do something totally out of blockchain. We're going to help a food delivery service build out their mobile app. Like, is that what's happening? Like how bad, not bad, I don't like good or bad, but how far off from core missions are dev shops going at this point?
Hard to speak for others, right? In our case, we're certainly staying very focused on our core mission. What we're doing is really helping, going into the direction of helping more Web 2 or like the non-Web 3 native companies take advantage of the platform that we have built, which is going to help build out the ecosystem around Boba. So we're still very much focused on our core. But in terms of some of the teams that we've spoken with, surviving is winning in an environment like this, right? So if the environment is so challenging that driving adoption for your protocol right now is very difficult, and regardless of how many marketing dollars or incentives you throw at it, it's not going to make a difference. If there's no shame in doing something else to generate revenue and survive in the meantime, and wait until the market gets better, and then come back to continuing building the protocol again. And in the meantime, maybe put it in maintenance mode. It doesn't mean you abandon it. You still maintain your community, but you're not just throwing resources away, hoping for the best. So I don't think there's any shame in doing something else to generate revenue and survive in the meantime when investors are all walking away.
Yeah. So I have a note here that says, a few weeks ago, community witnessed 120 M, I assume million, Boba being transferred to FTX, which is a vast majority of circulation. Can you explain a little bit about the relationship between the Boba tokens or users, what may have happened there, and FTX and the impact on what you're working on?
So there are a few misunderstandings in that statement.
Fair.
So yeah, one of them is assuming that those tokens came out of the circulating supply, which is not true, actually. Those tokens were locked tokens set aside for investors and current and future team members. And the reason they were sent to FTX was because FTX, so first of all, FTX was the first exchange to list Boba when the token launched last year. And they offered to be the custodian for these locked tokens. And they also offered to implement the gradual unlock schedule for these locked tokens over the next few years at no cost. So that was why the foundation decided to let FTX do that work and be the custodian. And at that time, FTX is one of the top 5 exchanges, and everybody trusted them. Nobody expected this to happen. So that's why. And so these tokens were not part of the circulating supply at all. They were never in circulation. They were locked tokens. And now we are working on exploring different options to help these investors and team members recover the allocations.
So just so I'm understanding, so 120 million Boba tokens were in FTX that were staked and owned by the foundation or owned by individual investors that participated in that 45 million Series A?
Some of them were, so basically these are locked tokens set aside for investors and team members. They were not part of the circulating supply, not part of the treasury that was meant to provide incentives for ecosystem growth and other purposes.
Okay. So they're not, so Boba's treasury didn't lose anything. It was people who had, how do treasuries store their tokens? How does Boba store their tokens?
In a multi-sig on-chain, those are safe, just like most projects.
And is that through a company that does that, or are you keeping it in like you figure out some way to do it yourself?
That's through the Boba Foundation.
So Boba Foundation is a couple people that have access to the multi-sig wallet. So each of them, I mean, stop me if this, like, I don't want to compromise any security stuff, but just trying to understand the general architecture of how foundations secure their funds. Is Boba giving it to, what's that company? A company to manage the funds, or each of the board members at the protocol will store, like they'll have a hardware wallet and they're safe in their house? Like what's actually happening?
So I'm not going to go into the specifics of Boba's arrangement, but in general, this is what most projects do, is to have several trusted individuals whose interests are aligned with the project to be multi-sig signers. And you need X out of Y signatures in order to move any funds around. And of course, everyone needs to be using a hardware wallet. That's just non-negotiable.
Okay, got it. And what do you think about that structure? So I'm kind of at a point where I'm like just questioning everything, trying to boil things down to first principles. So I appreciate you entertaining me with these super simple questions. Is that the way that it carries on? Because just for reference, right? It's like 6 months ago, even a few weeks ago, it's like, oh yeah, keep all your money on an exchange. There was some people who say that wasn't smart, but like Coinbase, FTX, these companies you could trust. Is this process the right way to do it? 5 years from now, do you think there'll be, 4 human beings that are at the board of a large token project storing hardware wallets, like in their garage? Is that, or do you think there's a company that kind of manages that? Like,
I would hope that the setup actually will become more decentralized rather than more centralized. But there's always going to be this dynamic tension, because having a centralized entity manage it is more convenient, and human nature tends towards a more convenient solution, all else being equal. A decentralized solution takes more coordination, but it's also more robust, more secure, no single points of failure. And so I would hope that we actually trend towards a more decentralized solution.
And what have you learned? So if you were to, rewind the clock a year, what would you tell yourself? What do you think maybe in terms of like base expectations that either storing tokens, building the way that people build projects, the way that people raise money, Like, how is Alan wiser now than you were a year ago from all the shit that's been going on in the world?
It's important to keep in mind the reason that we're building what we're building in the first place. The benefits of a transparent, permissionless, immutable blockchain infrastructure, right? If there's the reason why the kind of fraud that happened that we have seen at FTX, Alameda, and various other actors, there's that kind of those kinds of actions just simply would not have been possible in an open, transparent protocol, decentralized protocol, because everything would have been out in the open. There's no place to hide. As soon as something nefarious happens, people would have noticed, right? And we have to keep these principles in mind as we continue to build forward. And the key lesson that we're taking to heart is we've got to make it as easy as possible for developers to adopt these solutions, because human nature is human nature. If you don't make it easy, people won't use it. It will have to start with the developers, because unless it is easy for them, they won't build on it.
Mm-hmm. So you would have gone back a year ago. You would have said, "I wish I made it easier for developers to build on Boba." Or is that
so tactically, we will always focus on ease of adoption by a developer, but there's a lot more we can do. Tactically, I also wish the locked tokens for investors and team members weren't being custodied by FTX, right?
Yeah, totally. And where do you think that this goes? Do you think regulation becomes super clamped down? Do you have a more optimistic take that it becomes like U.S. regulation around crypto exchanges in particular becomes more clear? And obviously the strong negative take would be that there's a strong reaction from the federal government to clamp down, block everything, ban Bitcoin, ban exchanges, say, hey, we're not effing around anymore. We can't be sending money to North Korea. We can't be having billions of customers lose their money. We need a timeout. And we've seen this in other industries. You know, I mentioned this previously, but the psychedelic world had kind of an explosive era in the late 60s. And there was a lot of promising research happening around that. However, the abuse that was happening in the public was so strong, and it presented a strong opposing narrative to the federal government to send people to Vietnam. And so the federal government said, no more. Schedule 1, everything stops, 0 sales, 0 research for 50 years. And just in the last few years, it's now possible to research these mind medicines, and they're incredibly beneficial. So we have a 50-year gap of nothing happening because of, in my mind, a similar kind of abuse in the public market, and then a strong clampdown where the government specifically recognized the threat of the technology to the establishment. And in my view, the government, if they're smart, they recognize Bitcoin as a threat for global reserve currency to the US dollar. And I wonder, like, are we about to witness clampdown that just says 0 tolerance, ban it, public enemy number 1 is Bitcoin? Or do you think it's like, hey guys, I know you made a mistake. I know everyone's not bad, but we got to put some smart rules in place, and then things just kind of go on as they go on, even in a better way? Like, what's your realistic take as to what we're about to see?
Well, certainly policymakers are going to have a strong reaction to what happened recently. And based on, and it's hard to predict the future, but based on the latest conversations that we're following in DC, it does seem like the conversations actually are pretty reasonable and sensible. There's recognition that amongst some, not all policymakers, that this was not a failure of crypto or blockchain itself, right? This was a failure of, first of all, FTX was not even a US company, right? So US regulators can do whatever they wanted and still wouldn't have prevented this from happening. But this was a failure of the traditional opaque model of running financial institutions, coupled with a space that and also geography that happens to be unregulated. So we got the worst of both worlds, actually, between crypto and TradFi. TradFi is okay, but it's heavily regulated, so it mitigates some of the downsides of opacity. But in the case of FTX, it's run as a TradFi, so it's completely opaque. Nobody knew what they were doing behind the scenes. At the same time, they're unregulated, so there's no oversight whatsoever. Because as opposed to DeFi, which is transparent on chain, sure, it's unregulated, but the whole world can watch. The whole world is watching, and so the transparency takes the role of a regulator in the case of TradFi. So when there's no transparency and no regulation, that's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah. Yeah. How are you doing? I mean, with having 120 million of the Boba tokens lost at FTX in a pretty sharp down market after raising a ton of money last year, are you and the team feeling kind of business as usual, just keep on going? Is it difficult? Like, are you having a tough time parsing the future? And I'm curious to hear what it was like, what it's like, what is it hard, or do you feel like you just kind of methodically walk through all the steps? And
well, anyone who tells you it's business as usual is lying.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Right. At the same time, it's not, like I said before, it's not as if we are going through an existential crisis.
That's
for
true.
the project.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
Totally. Right? The team is strong. We're still hiring.
Yeah.
We're growing. Like, we're building up transaction volume. We've got multi-chain. So there are a lot of good things going on. And we're working on a plan to, make the investors and team members whole that were affected by the downfall of FTX. So I'm feeling actually cautiously optimistic. Certainly there's a sense of agency, like the actions that we're taking to deal with the tokens that were locked at FTX, to deal with the changed broader environment. I think things are never as good or as bad as people think they are.
Yeah, that's a good line right there. Yeah. How about people? Are you following any people in particular that you're learning from? Any books or blogs that you pay attention to regularly that impact your thinking?
Well, yeah, a lot. In our space, for example, when it comes to reflections on the state of rollups, where the technology will go, I really like Polynia on Twitter. They maintain a blog as well, and the writings are really thoughtful, the posts. In terms of someone who's been reflecting on the recent events and lessons learned from actually not just FTX, but Three Arrows and other blowups this year, I really like Jason Choi. He's been sharing his thoughts on Twitter as well. And then in terms of books, I actually think that maybe your more recent audience may not know him, Andy Grove, the legendary CEO of Intel. He's passed away for a while now, but what he's written about leadership and management, a lot of it remains true. Those ideas might not have been communicated in most politically correct ways by today's standards. He's very hard driving, but he also inspired tremendous loyalty amongst his teams and delivered amazing results and change an industry and by extension the world. I mean, Intel without microprocessors, where would we be? So yeah, I read his books many years ago, and a lot of those lessons still ring true, and I still aspire to live up to a lot of those. And I also read a lot of poetry.
Do you?
I write poetry myself too, and that helps to not just bring balance to my work and my life, but also helps to become more creative and help center myself and bring to a more Zen-centered, calm state, which helps with everything that I do.
What do you do to get into a state of, before you begin to write any poetry, what would you do to get into that state?
take a few deep breaths, look around, and pay attention to what's beautiful in the world,
Mm,
and pay attention to inner thoughts and feelings that are bubbling up in that moment, and then just start writing. Don't overthink it.
it's a good
The words
line.
will come.
Yeah. I heard a quote recently that was, it said, beauty is a call to awakening, which I really liked.
Oh, I love that.
So simple, but it's like, oh yeah, it is.
That actually reminded me of a book that I am reading right now. Actually, it's called Beauty: An Invisible Embrace. Check that out. It's so rich that I can only read 2 to 3 pages at a time, and I have to stop and digest.
Yeah. That's how you know
One
it's
of those
good.
books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other particular, writers that you find yourself coming back to?
John O'Donohue. So he's the author of Beauty. Amazing writer and philosopher.
An orator with an amazing voice, the Irish
Oh
accent.
my gosh.
Yeah.
Yes. Also like David White, they happen to be great friends of each other. David White's poetry, penetrating words.
It's awesome. Alan,
Yeah.
where are you? First of all, do you publish any of that? Do you write any of your poetry online? And then where are you personally? Are you sharing anything on Twitter or any personal usernames you want to throw out there?
Sure. I'm Alan Chiu on Twitter, AlanChiu. Happy to engage and interact with anyone on Twitter. I publish some of my poems on Instagram just to share with friends, but I haven't really published anything in more serious format yet.
That's awesome. Good for you. It's a good way to balance it. You can't have all crypto all the time. You'll go crazy. And you also won't be as good at it. I'm convinced. The best developers, the best founders I know, they have a strong balance of some other artistic expression that helps them get into the flow state. So, Alan, thanks so much, man. Congrats on all the progress you guys have made. I wish you the absolute best through all this.
Thank you.
The shitstorm that we're in, and I'm sure you'll come out the other side shining. Appreciate your time, man.
Thank you. Really enjoyed this chat. Thanks for having me.